All right, hi. So I'm Matthew Vimislik. This is game design analysis of improv theater. Uh, you may know what improv is from TV shows like Whose Lines Is It Anyway, Reno 911, Middleditch and Schwartz, or podcasts like Comedy Bang Bang or other narrative podcasts on Earwolf. Or maybe you've seen the improv adjacent slew of D&D campaign shows like Critical Role, Dimension 20, and Acquisitions Incorporated. But its roots are on the stage. Improv is a show made up on the spot by the improvisers on stage, and although an improv show can be a drama, a mystery, or a horror, most improv shows are comedy. They'll ask for suggestions from the audience, keep the energy up, and honestly, you all should go to an improv show like at least once. Because it's really hard to describe the vibe, because whenever I've watched film versions of improv, like it just doesn't hit the same way as when you see it live. It's just a lot more action-packed. It's a lot more like, what's going to happen next? I'm not selling it well when what's going to happen next? But it's fun, I swear. But lucky for you, improv shows are generally pretty cheap. And that's not because it's cheap to run the show. They still have to run a theater. That's because the improv shows are largely advertisements for improv classes. The money doesn't come from show tickets. It mostly comes from improv students who invest a lot of time and money to learn from that troupe and perform on stage. At the end of every show, you'll usually get the sales pitch of, hey, if you want to learn how we, did all that wacky, who knows what's going to happen stuff performed on stage like we just did, sign-up sheets are up front. Classes are $120 for 6 weeks. That's where the money comes from. You see a group of performers make a whole audience laugh, and now you can learn how to do that. Improv shows are rewarding for the audience. Like, they legitimately have a great time, and it's an awesome deal. There's definitely one in your hometown, but, it's even more rewarding to be on the stage itself. So these are just some of the famous improv theaters across the US and Canada, and every one of these has produced writers, actors, and directors whose work you have seen. But for every one of these improv schools, there are a dozen more located across nearly every city in the United States, along with small independent troupes, theaters, and most colleges have their own improv teams. US and Canada, and also London has a whole bunch. Improv is an industry sustaining theaters across North America, and it's worth exploring why it's fun and what we can learn from it. So why learn it from me? Hi, I'm Matthew Vimislik, and I've been a game developer for over a decade at Workinman Interactive, where I've made web and mobile games for Nickelodeon, NBC Universal, Disney, Sesame Street, Atari, and I worked on the Magic 8-Ball display up in the Hall of Fame on the second floor of the museum. That was me. And many other games as an artist, project manager, and designer. In my spare time, I also just make games. I made a few visual novels that have been received pretty positively by fellow devs, and I run a YouTube channel on visual novel design where I do videos on programming, writing, and production planning. I was also an active improv actor for about 6 years. I did over 100 shows and competitions, festivals, bars, and on stage here in Rochester on a house team with Village Idiots, and later with Flower City Improv at the Focus Theater. They're like right across from Parcel 5. You're probably not going to get to it through all the Jazz Fest stuff, and I don't think they have a show tonight, but they're still active. I got into improv as a creative outlet and a group activity shortly after I started working as a game designer, and I've been experimenting with a lot of different formats and considering the design of improv as a collaborative narrative game from the very beginning. That's the lens I came into this hobby with, and now I want to show it to you through my eyes. So part 1, the history of improv. One of the earliest inspirations of improv was commedia dell'arte, a 16th century Italian form of improvised theater done by traveling troupes. The reason they did improvised performances was because they would travel from town to town, sometimes performing in one town for a few months, and improvisation made it so an audience member could go every day and see a different play. Improvisation also made it easy for the troupe to fit their material for different audiences, make contemporary jokes, and get away with a lot more controversial material. I cut a lot of stuff out of this talk. He was banned by Napoleon, Commedia dell'arte. It's crazy. Part of what made each troupe unique was their own collection of lazzi and concetti, which were physical gags and jokes that they regularly rehearsed and reused between performances. The story of the play itself was agreed on beforehand, often a familiar story or they'd riff on a popular news story, and the improvisation is really just how they'd fill the gaps between the set story beats. Each member of troupe would take on the role of an archetypical commedia dell'arte character. The innamorati were the young lovers, Magnifico was the master of the house, Harlequin was the romantic servant, the Capitano was the retired military man, along with another dozen stock characters. These characters were strictly defined and well established. They had their own distinct costumes, relationships to each other, masks, methods of movement called leading centers, and actors would often specialize in just one role, so they could perfect their own particular spin on that stock character. For lots of complicated reasons, this form of theater disappears. I already said it was Napoleon, but that's what I wrote. But it directly inspired pantomime theater with its Lazzi, slapstick theater, and situational comedies. Pretty much every sitcom, in a weird, distant way, is related to these people. This form of improvised theater was created with the audience in mind. And even after modern improv created its own set of theater rules, many improv troupes that wanted to bring their talents to TV and movies still ended up following a formula that's actually much closer to the commedia dell'arte format. For instance, the TV show Reno 911 has each actor take on a stock role, and how they format their scenes is they have a rough idea of where they want the scenes to start and end, and they improvise dialogue and actions on the way there. Each actor has their own running gags in their back pocket they can fall back on, and they need each episode to return back to a status quo, the established end. But we can also see this with video games that emphasize player agency in their narratives. Players have a selection of repeatable actions that they can do across the game, which could be kind of mechanical Lazzi, really, or practice physical gags. The dialogue itself can be incredibly unique from player to player, so it can feel like the story is being made up as it goes along, but scenarios have beginnings and endings that the player fills the gaps in between their actions. Again, not bad. This is a great format for it, but it's not quite like modern improv. The roots of modern improv came out from training tools for young actors. Two teachers independently came up with improv formats, and they're very different approaches to essentially the same end. Viola Spolin trained at Neva Boyd's group work school in Chicago in the 1920s, where they used games and improvisation to teach language skills, social skills, and build confidence for a diverse pool of young students, including inner city kids and immigrants where English wasn't even their first language. Combined with some ideas from sociologist J.L. Moreno and Russian director Konstantin Stanislavski of The Method, Spolin taught what she dubs theater games for anyone 6 years old and up, refining her ideas from the 1940s until she eventually founded the Second City Company with her son Paul Sills in 1960 and solidified many of her teachings in the book Improvisation for the Theater in 1963. Across the globe, Keith Johnstone was a drama teacher and director in London in the 1950s, who in an attempt to unteach his students to make them more spontaneous actors, came up with theater sports, where two teams competed in a series of improvised games in front of an audience. He later moved to Calgary, Canada in the 1970s, founded the Loose Moose Theater Company to continue innovating formats, and ended up writing Improvisation in the Theater, or Improvisation in the Theater. I don't know why improv, it's weird. And Improv for Storytellers, which are two other seminal textbooks on improv. Both of them had pretty similar approaches to teaching their students, with a strong emphasis on being present in the moment. And a lot of improv warm-ups we still play today are built on games they taught to their students to keep people quick, creative, in the moment, and give a sense of group consciousness with fellow players. These are games. They're meant to have children play with scenes and let them explore the stage with minimal judgment on what they actually did, but instead, in Viola Spolin's textbook, she had points of conversation to have with students to reflect back on the choices they made in the scene and find out what worked, what didn't, what they excelled in, and what they needed to work on. Now keep in mind, most students involved in theater would take these basic courses, whether you wanted to be a writer, director, singer, dancer, or whatever, you learned these basics. And today, improv actors come from many different backgrounds outside of the arts and come in with their own knowledge and skills and bring it to the stage. Improv isn't just for professionals, it's for hobbyists too. So now, how do we perform improv? Because it's a fun game anyone can play, and it's been iterated on for, I've established, 70 years now for that exact purpose, to play. One game that encapsulates a lot of the granular acting challenges in improv scene work is three-line scene, a warm-up where you have an entire scene within 3 lines of dialogue. First one person says a line, second person responds to that line, first person responds to the second person's response. Done. It's very easy. Within that 3-line scene, though, there are a lot of general guidelines that improvisers have to keep in mind to make this 3-line scene actually good. So number one, you have to actually listen to your partner. I know that sounds obvious, but it's a challenge. Within 1 line of dialogue, your partner can be conveying a lot of information. Let's say the first line is, "No way, Ralph, that ride is too scary." From this, we know your name is Ralph, and this is someone that's familiar with you. This is somebody who knows your name. Depending on their tone, you could be a spouse, friend, or family member. By their body language, let's say they do, "No way, Ralph, that ride is too scary." You can know they're angry. Something about a choice your character Ralph made has made them angry. Maybe got them angry on purpose, or maybe it was an accident. And just looking at the words, like ride could mean an amusement park ride, or it could be a term for a vehicle. So you could be at Disneyland, you could mean your own front yard showing off your brand new car. And scary can also mean it's physically scary, like it's, looks too dangerous, or maybe it's like a big Halloween decoration, like it's a bat or something. So while you're listening, you need to react. While they're actively talking to you, you need to have a reaction at the ready. And an initial reaction can set the tone for the scene. It's often just easier to react first, like when you see your partner having a certain tone or emotion. So usually, like even before they start talking, they're like, "Ralph, that ride's too scary." You can see how they're reacting, and you can just choose an emotion that responds to that. And the answer is any emotion. Any emotion works at all. You just decide to pick an emotion, and that's the correct one. Del Close, who taught at Second City and basically trained the cast of SNL for 30 years, came up with a rule of thumb called yes and, where by default you should agree with your partner and add something else. So yes and would be, first, emotional reaction, "Yeah, happy. I paid extra for it to be scary." That doesn't mean your character can never say no. I've also heard it as gift giving in a scene, where you need to treat every interaction with your scene partner like you're trading gifts. They give you a gift, you thank them and acknowledge them for it, and you respond with a gift of your own. So you could also say, "It's not scary, Diane, it's my windowless van, and it's my home." The character has denied it's scary, but it takes what your scene partner has given you and adds a bunch for them to work with. Sorry, I did just make these all up on the spot, so I was not sure if these were going to work. So now with your second line, you've responded and you've hopefully added a lot to the scene with your response, and it's up to your scene partner to take all this new information in and justify it to conclude the scene. This is the part where I couldn't make it up. Players can respond with whatever they want as long as they acknowledge the shared reality they've created, build off it, and help justify the statements of others. In this case, we have established the ride is too scary, but we can also establish it's perfectly safe, and now we need to justify how both of those statements can be true. Now, the reason why I came up with these ahead of time, I didn't make up these ones ahead of time, is because very rarely are 3-line scenes good. It's just a warm-up. It's usually pretty bad. It's just important that improvisers practice building a scene together, and a 3-line scene is a very compressed version of that. In a full scene, it's perfectly all right to respond to, "Ralph, that ride is too scary," with, "Huh?" Because you're still taking the base reality your scene partner created and adding something else to it, that Ralph is inattentive and gives your partner options to respond with. If you were to keep playing 3-line scene for more than 3 lines with just this knowledge, it would still suck pretty bad, though, because you'd be missing a huge part of modern improv. We got to talk about the game of the scene. We use the term game a lot in improv, and it can mean a lot of different things. We have games in improv, which I'll cover a little bit later. I know this is already confusing, but the game of the scene is the root of scene work. The game of the scene is often defined as the thing the scene is about, but that sort of oversimplifies it. The game of the scene is basically the skeleton of the scene, and when the players on stage can identify an element of their scene they want to build on, they'll identify that element as the game and try to build a narrative on top of that structure together. So every improv troupe has their own definition of it and will generally orient their scene strategies around it. At Upright Citizens Brigade, they defined the game as the first unusual thing to happen in the scene. So you'll do a scene as normal, but just naturally, because you're improvising, something weird's going to crop up. Someone's going to say something that doesn't quite gel with that base reality. It's the job of your partner to recognize, hey, that's weird, and they'll follow that narrative string and just see where it goes. The game of the scene can also be about finding a pattern in the scene and heightening or exploring it. Maybe you find yourself in a game of one-upmanship with a fellow barista, and the game is about making coffee more and more elaborately, beyond what is physically possible. Maybe the characters in your scene keep finding four-leaf clovers, and now the game of the scene is these characters being overwhelmed with their extreme luck. The game of the scene could be reenacting a known narrative, maybe you bought a magic Skittle, planted it, and you find yourself acting out Jack and the Beanstalk, but with a candy twist. You don't want to work too hard to find the game of the scene. You want to focus on those basics we covered in the three-line scene and allow the game to emerge organically. The trick is making sure everyone identifies the game of the scene together, willingly commit to exploring where the game takes them together, and finding its natural conclusions. Scenes almost never end with a neat wrap-up. It's often a matter of deciding, like, this is a good stopping point for this game. We beat the giant. That's fine. It's good enough. The game of the scene isn't necessarily the point of the scene either. It's just a narrative tool that can help give a group consensus and direction for your scene partners to work towards, and can give the scene some focus. You can have a scene without identifying a game in the moment, but afterwards it's usually easy to spot what the game of the scene was. That's because stories themselves are types of patterns. The audience is trying to apply a narrative structure to what they're watching, and luckily other players on the stage want to help the players in these open scenes. Improv troupes usually have 4 to 8 players, and most scenes have 2 or 3 people in them, with the occasional larger scene or group scene. That means for most of a show, the player will be in the back line, which is where players stand on stage when they aren't actively in the scene. Usually in the back, in a line, the back line. The back line still needs to pay close attention, because even though they aren't going into a new scene, there are some things for the back line to do. If you don't have someone on lights, it's the backline's job to sweep edit the scene, which is the action that shows a scene is ended and it's time to start a new scene. When you're on stage with your partner, you don't get to decide this scene's ended. It's the responsibility of the backline. They'll run in front of the players on the scene to signal it's time for another scene, and then 2 other players from the backline will come forward. You usually do this if a scene has reached its natural conclusion or just stinks and needs to be put out of its misery. If you have someone on lights, they can also turn off the lights a second to black out a scene, which does the same thing. Ideally, you'll swipe on a button, which is usually a line that draws a big laugh, and hopefully is also a great conclusion for the scene, which is why it's important for your backline to pay attention and spot when a scene hits that point. The backline can also provide other directions for a scene. They can provide sound effects for actions on stage. They can hand props over, or in some cases, be the props. They can call out stage directions, like later at the volcano, and now the characters are at a volcano. They can call out 1 year later, and suddenly the scene cuts to 1 year later. They can tag a player out to swap places with them, signaling the other character is still here, but I am a new character, and this is happening in another period of time. These are very complicated things, but it really does keep the entire performance fun and energetic. It's also incredibly helpful because it's an awful feeling to be on stage and not doing well in a scene. So it's great to have improvisers on stage who are paying attention and can spot where it can be improved in the moment and assist when needed. If you're afraid to be on stage and act in front of people, this happens with a lot of starting improvisers, the best thing you can do is just be a really good editor for a scene. You will become the hero for that night. You will get free mozzarella sticks at Denny's. I can guarantee you that. But another helpful tool to have your game with another helpful tool is to have a game with rules that are set ahead of time. So now we can talk about the other kind of game. So all open scenes are open, which means the players proceed with the scene however they want. In short form games, both the players and the audience are given the structure for a game to play on stage ahead of time, and the improvisers play within those rules. If you've ever seen Whose Line Is It Anyway, their whole format is structured around short form games. However, the players often have their own hidden rules they hide from the audience to make these games play better and ensure a better outcome for the audience. Dating game is one of my favorite games. It's done in the format of a mystery date show where a contestant has to ask 3 people they can't see some questions, and based on those questions, they decide who they will go on a date with. One improviser, the contestant, is sent out of the room, and the troupe gets suggestions from the audience for 3 famous people. Those will be the improviser's mystery dates, and they have to not only pick out a date, but determine who these 3 famous people are. The audience sees a host lead the contestant through 3 questions for each contestant, and then the contestant will correctly guess each famous person. It's like a magic act every time we do it, in the sense that it's all fake. This is a guessing game, which means there's always the chance the contestant could take a long time guessing who the different mystery dates are. So often these rules are agreed to beforehand to assist the contestant in this game that gives the game some manageable structure. In one troupe I was in, our rules were this. The famous people would be 1 living, 1 dead, and 1 fictional, and we generally keep to that order. For the first question, we always stuck with, where would you take me on your first date? And the mystery people would have to give answers that directly reveal important identifying information. For the second question, the contestant asks 3 individual questions for each person, which will act as signals for the rest of the troupe. If the contestant has a good idea who they are, they ask a question that relates to that famous person, but doesn't include details from the first question. Aha, trickery. If the question does not relate to that character, the host will take the opportunity to rephrase the question for the contestant in such a way that includes actual information about that person, which tells the contestant, oh, I was way off. I guess Stephen Hawking can walk, so that would not work. If the contestant has no idea who that person is, they'll ask that mystery person to clarify something they brought up in question 1. This signals to that person that their clues weren't strong enough and now they need to give bigger clues. By the end of that round, the host will ask the final question, which will be geared toward the person the contestant seemed the least sure about and may in itself reveal more information. After these answers, the host gives a spiel about what vacation they'll go on if they win, which gives the contestant time to think, and oh my god, there are some thinkers. Afterwards, the contestant guesses the people in the order of absolutely sure to has no idea about, so if they're stuck in a particular scene, they're saved for last, and the host can assist. So by this flowchart, this simple game has a lot of rules on the back end to remember. So why not just cheat and let the contestant listen in? Because it's a game! It's a game for the contestants to play. Improv games are great because the game and the scene is already largely defined, and instead you can focus on listening, reacting, justifying, instead of trying to find the game and the scene together. I was not sure how that mic and the screaming thing would work. Was that okay? Was the sound okay? All right, cool. I didn't want to hurt anybody. Another short form game. In Half-Life, you act out a short scene and redo it twice. Once at half speed and another at quarter speed. This can be an annoying one because you need to use whatever you can use at your disposal to create story moments that are easy for you to remember. Make all your dialogue important, make all your body motions big, and when you have to do it half speed, stick to important plot beats and move on. You do this twice. This is a rough one. In gibberish poetry, you recite a poem you made up in a gibberish language while acting it out with your body, and another improviser translates it line by line for the audience by copying the body movements and saying what it means in English. This is really fun when you have 2 improvisers who are a little competitive, because the poet will try to mess up the translator with their body movement, because once the translator says, like, oh, this is a poem about the sun, and then someone does the rain, it's like, oh, how do I work that in there? While the translator will create an absurd translation that the poet needs to incorporate into their body movements. In soap opera, this one's so much fun, also known as telenovela, you act out a scene as normal at a low intensity, right? Not looking at your scene partner, but whenever the director plays music, you and your partner have to lock eyes and keep playing the same scene, but like a soap opera with high emotions. So it can go from like, oh, do you think they even make Tab anymore? Do they even make Tab for people like us? For the telenovela version, you can also switch to Spanish, which I got to see that once with actual Spanish speakers, and that was an absolute blast. When the music turns off, you continue the scene like normal. This one gets really silly because you'll oscillate between really dramatic moments, and then when the music stops, you need to immediately justify why the energy dropped. There are absolutely tons of short-form improv games. That being said, most improv games are meant to be a few minutes long, and even open scenes, like without these set rules, they tend to drag out if they go more than 10 minutes. So to fill the length of an entire show, a different narrative structure on top of open scenes and games needs to be constructed. Long-form formats are large narrative structures where we can place scenes together like building blocks, letting previous scenes inspire the decisions that players make in later scenes and try to build and reinforce themes and patterns throughout the entire performance. My little reward to myself, by the way, is if I have time at the end, like a lot of time, if I talk really, really fast, I get to talk about that. I want to tell you about this format so much. But that's not as helpful as the Heralds, developed by Del Close, which is one of the most popular long-form formats, and it's probably much easier to understand than that thing. So in a Herald, you have 3 groups of 3 scenes, interspersed with group scenes that involve the whole backline and are a palette cleanser between these different narrative beats. In the opener, you generate ideas that will be used to inspire the scenes, and then in the second group of scenes, you take themes or narratives from that first set and you heighten them. If the first scene is about waiting in the DMV, for instance, you can heighten it by thematically having people wait in line in hell, or you can heighten it narratively by cutting to a few weeks later when the people at the DMV line have to consider cannibalism to survive. In the last set of scenes, you want to take everything you've created throughout all of these earlier scenes, heighten them further, and reach the natural conclusion of these narratives. At this stage, you can have characters from different scenes meet each other and conflict with each other, and this part's just chaotic fun. Just like in improv games, long-form formats have rules to give shows structure, but they're much looser than commedia dell'arte, because again, the thing that inspired modern improv was letting players be in the moment and letting them be creative and giving them simple rules that they can internalize to create good stories naturally. Over a long-form show, there's usually a lot of chaos and noise and different ideas generated in the beginning, and the formats are about distilling and building on those ideas. And by the end, you usually get thematically someplace completely different from where you started. It's hard to keep that in mind when you have to do it line by line over the course of the scene and over the course of a show, but eventually, you get better at it, and when you get really good at it, it's really fun. There's a lot more to learn about improv. There is so much to learn about improv, but that should all give us a good basis for looking at what makes it fun for the players by looking at the nested game loops that keep players engaged. The improv game loops. Looking back on the improv stage, we have the players, we have the backline, and we have the audience. Now that we all know what goes into their performance, we can look into what makes the performance fun by looking at the nested game loops that keep players engaged. The core moment-to-moment gameplay is to listen to your scene partners, make a strong interpretation of what they're saying, and add to the shared reality. Even when you're in the back line, you have to be ready to listen, interpret, and add, since you could be coming into the scene or cutting it. Beyond that, we have an exploratory game loop, where we have to find a pattern in the scene, build on that pattern, and then find the logical conclusion of that pattern. This loop can get a little crazier because you can have multiple games in a scene, and you can have an improv game that adds a rigid defined structure on top of whatever game you create, and then you have the structure of the entire show like the Herald that you need to build your framework within. So this gameplay loop is used a lot over the course of a single show. Outside of that, we have an evaluation loop, how the scene is doing. Throughout the show, you need to assess the scene, determine how it's going, and adjust your actions. If you're in the back line, this is where you need to know when to edit a scene with a sweep, tag out, or jump in the scene. If you're in the scene, you need to make a lot of adjustments to the scene throughout. And this is where a lot of improvisers mess up. This is a really hard one right here. Because if they don't think the audience is enjoying the show, they'll overcorrect, and they'll fall into some big habits. A few times I've just been riffing, and I immediately recognized that was a terrible idea. I really worked on this script. I should stick to it. So I can fail at this stage here. So yeah, this is where a lot of improvisers start going blue, or going for cheap laughs. So they'll say swear words, fart, do a silly voice, and their scene work starts to get sloppy. So if I don't think you guys are enjoying this, I will do a fart in a silly voice. These may help in the moment, but if you're not careful, they can also break your patterns and ruin the shared reality that you've created with your partners. And that's where this final loop enters in, the progression loop. You're going to grow as an improviser. You're going to start teaming up with better improvisers and make better shows. When you start doing improv at a troupe, they'll usually have you do classes and teach you different skills at different levels. You'll get graduation shows when you finish a level, but you're usually just performing with your class for friends and family. Once you finish all the courses and the teachers think you're good enough to be on stage with paying customers, this is where you can audition for a house team. House teams will perform shows regularly at the theater for the public, maybe twice a month per team. And independent teams will often rent their own venues, perform at festivals, and once you reach a certain level of skill, you can coach teams or teach classes. As you grow as a performer, you're aiming to surround yourself with better and better improvisers at your level. And if you're a super cool improviser, you're also trying to raise the abilities of everyone else in your troupe because you just want to keep playing with your friends. It's really fun. Aside from all this, there's also finding your own unique individual talents and learning how to leverage them. Maybe you're really good at over-the-top character work, or maybe you're a bit more subtle. You could be entertainingly verbose, or you know how to kill with a single word. Every improviser brings their own talents to the table, and finding out what those are and building up those individual skills is a fun element all its own. So when someone gets into improv and starts enjoying scene work, there's always a level of progress to keep you in the hobby. In addition to the fun, I think there's some practical reasons for learning improv. This is where I'm selling you on improv. I don't even work for a troupe. I think it's really fun. I think there's lots of practical reasons for learning improv to add to your workflow as well that can help you create stories faster. There they are. Writers and actors on SNL, SCTV, and Upright Citizens Brigade, who basically were all Second City students, used characters, situations, and stories they came up with in improv performances and refined them to create some of their most famous sketches. On SNL, who remembers Matt Foley, motivational speaker? Yeah, for those of you on Discord, a lot of people raise their hands. Yeah, that was workshopped on Second City's main stage. He used to do that weekly. Same thing as Michael Myers' Dieter, and Martin Short's Ed Grimley, which appeared both on SNL and SCTV. And then the Upright Citizens Brigade TV series was made by taking their best scenes they made in their long-running, long-form show, AssCat 3000, or as it's spelled, AssCat 3000, and rewrote and refined them to fit in 22-minute episodes. That's 4 S's, if you're Googling that. Improv also makes its way into video games. You may have seen the viral videos about the NPCs from the 2023 Spider-Man 2 having some pretty crazy conversations. That's because the crowd NPC dialogue was not written out. It was just improvised, prompted from professional actors in the booth, and they improvised on those prompts. You don't have to hire writers to create a whole bunch of filler conversation. You just need improvisers and a voice director who's, game for it. But most people who do improv are not professional actors and writers. They're teachers, tech workers, personal trainers, hospital workers, students, and a surprising number of retirees. For them, the point isn't to transfer the stories and skills from improv into their other endeavors. They simply want to get better at doing the thing they love. So while the gameplay loops cover the elements that keep players engaged with the hobby, we also want to acknowledge the core hook of improv that brings a lot of people into the hobby in the first place, making individualized creative decisions and being rewarded for your creativity. Part 4, improv in games. So first off, as I've established, improv is itself a genre of games, and it was designed as such. Like many genres of games, it can bleed into other genres, so we have to identify what games have players engage in play patterns closest to improv. Like if you play most tabletop RPGs, the intention is for you to create a character and then leverage their abilities to surmount challenges. In this case, the improv-esque nature of the tabletop RPG is largely dependent on how the players want to engage with gameplay. If they're focused on combat and dice rolls to determine success, and the DM does most of the heavy lifting with world building, you probably aren't doing something that's very similar to improv at all. But if you're focused on collaboratively crafting a story within the confines of the rules, and you're not so worried about success and failure as you are about making a memorable experience, then that's very similar to improv. LARPs usually encourage that kind of engagement, and then there are some TTRPG systems like Fiasco and Low Stakes. I think Fiasco came up with a talk earlier today. They make the point of the game to create a story, with the mechanics closer to a short-form improv game than D&D. Exquisite Corpse. Who's played Exquisite Corpse before? Yeah. For those of you on Discord, people raised their hands. Exquisite Corpse is an old parlor game where you draw a part of a figure and then give it to the next person in the line to continue. And you get a part of the figure from the previous person. Over time, as more and more people add on to it, and as people riff on earlier editions, these things look weirder and weirder until you get a menagerie of crazy-looking things. Actually, I forgot to mention, you're only supposed to look at the previous person's, so you're not seeing the totality of it at any given point. You're only seeing one other person's contribution. So Exquisite Corpse is a pretty popular game for creatives, and there's lots of variants for writing a story or poem, editing an image, or creating a response to an image, drawing a comic, and lots of other types of creative expression. Anything where there are discrete pieces of a creative endeavor that can be distributed amongst many players, and they do not communicate their intentions outside of the collaborative pieces that were created. See, I'm such a game designer because I was like, I need to specify exactly the criteria where this needs to be built in. They count as an Exquisite Corpse style game. And of course, those were all games focused on collaborating with others, but social deduction games can also lend themselves really well to creative narrative decisions. Among Us is the popular modern example, and Blood on the Clock Tower from 2022 is another great one mechanically. These are both riffs built on the social game Mafia or Werewolf. In these games, there's a deceiver team and a guesser team, each with their own win conditions. The deceiver team knows who else is a deceiver, but the guessers don't know which anyone else is. Each round, the deceiver team eliminates a guesser, and then all of the players, deceivers and guessers, vote on who to eliminate. In these games, the guessers are trying to observe and build on the actions of others to create patterns, and then test those patterns they came up with against a set social map. For the deceivers, though, they're also observing and building to create patterns, but they want to create convincing false patterns to make the guessers not vote off any deceivers. A game that's been pretty popular for streamers lately is Suck Up, which uses an AI generative model to play the innocent townsfolk, while the player as a vampire uses props and lies to get the townsfolk to invite the player in their home. You have to come up with a lie to get you in the house. The AI character will come up with reasons why they don't want to let you in, and then you need to build on their reasoning to come up with an excuse that convinces them to fight you in. If you don't properly build on their story, they're suspicious of you and they won't let you in. Now, as you may have noticed, these games utilize either other players or generative AI models acting as other players to create their improv-like feel, since players can respond with absolutely anything, and the game has to account for a near limitless number of responses. For most of us here, who are generally narrative designers or work within narrative fiction, that's kind of hard. It's kind of hard to do and incorporate in our games. Luckily, though, improv to the rescue, because there's another type of engagement with improv that works. Throughout this talk, I've emphasized that improv is more fun for the players in the audience, and I will stand by that. That's because there are some short-form improv games that bring some audience members on stage, make them part of the act, and are often the first step to get an audience member to say, hey, I think I could do this improv thing. In moving bodies, one or two volunteers are brought on stage, and it's their job to move the bodies of the players on the stage, usually with some simple tapping on the limb they want to move. When they move a performer, the performer immediately needs to justify their new body position. If the volunteer makes you bend down, you could say, hey, I just found something on the floor. And you can also encourage volunteers. The other person on stage might say, I'd better get a better look at that, encouraging the volunteer to also get them to look down. If they mess up, like making the person face upward, you need to justify it. Wow, look at how high that thing got all of a sudden, really quick. In Pillars, we bring a volunteer on stage and tell them when a player taps you on the shoulder, say the first word that pops in your head. The players on stage will do a scene, and regularly during the scene, they'll start a sentence and partway through, tap the volunteer on the shoulder, and whatever the volunteer says, the player has to repeat. Boy, I sure love clouds. Tap clouds. Really simple. Really simple interaction for the volunteer, but for the players, our job is to take what the volunteer said and make that the focus for a while. You don't necessarily need to take the suggestion at face value. Instead of talking about regular old clouds, for example, you could add on like, boy, I sure love clouds of radioactive dust after an atomic blast. But it's important to take whatever suggestion you get, the gift, you need to accept that gift, acknowledge the gift, and add on to it, give a gift back. And in Story Story Die, the improvisers line up, and when they're directed at by the player who's designated as the director, they tell a story. Regularly, the director will point at different improvisers who need to continue the story from the same spot the last improviser left off. But if they stall, stumble, or don't pick up the story right, or are just bad, it's the audience's job to yell out, "Die!" That improviser is kicked out of the line, and we start this cycle again. In this game, we usually try to encourage the audience to shout out, "Die." They don't want to kick us off stage, guys. They like us. They like everyone on stage. So the director will either make the game harder by speeding it up, so we're just naturally going to fail. They'll make us talk at the same time, and that can get kind of nuts. Or we will just, if an audience really does not want to say die, we will purposely mess up. Because we just really want that reaction from the audience, and we want them participating in this game. In these games, we prompt a user for input, incorporate it into our narrative, and then we reflect that back to the audience in a playful way. The audience can't make a wrong decision. Whatever they do, we accept their decisions and we build on them. This prompt, incorporate, reflect is a very simplified idea that can be approached in a lot of different ways, but these improv games are a good way to look at them. And just to stress, these are not all-encompassing. These are not the only ways to get the audience to do improv-like activities. But these games in particular, it just made me think of some other games that I really enjoyed. So Moving Bodies reminds me of the Stanley Parable. In that game, you're given a path, the prompt, and whether you stay on or divert from that path, the game incorporates those inputs, and the narrator reflects the player's actions by giving narrative reasons why Stanley is doing those things, because you're Stanley. If you decide not to follow a line, the narrator might say, "Stanley was so bad at following directions, it's incredible he wasn't fired years ago." There, he's taken your input of, "I'm not following this line," and now he's given a justification for why you're not doing that. This works because while the narrator prompts the player to follow the paths, the game is purposely encouraging you to divert from the path and not follow instructions, either through its design, making sure there are no mechanical ways for you to follow the narrator's instructions, or by using the narrator as a way to reward the player for exploring the space with funny dialogue. This is a game where it actively wants you to play within that narrative space. Even when the game is being obstinate, it listens, interprets, and adds meaning to the scene. Pillars reminds me of Emily Short's interactive fiction puzzle game, The Mary Jane of Tomorrow. In this game, you give access to information to your robot, which influences its behavior from then on. Let it learn about cowgirls, and it'll start talking a bit like a cowpoke. Give it a book on poetry, it'll rhyme, and if you give it a book on apples, it will be very specific about the types of apples used in recipes from then on. The player is prompted to give the robot data, and that's incorporated by tagging and randomizing the robot's dialogue from the libraries associated with the prompted data, and the robot's dialogue reflects those influences. Dialogue like that can be assembled by creating template sentences that can be put together based on variables produced during the course of gameplay. We don't want this just to be feedback for player actions. We want to take player actions and build on them to show how their actions have affected the people, the world, the reality around them. In the examples on screen, we might not actually have Gerald, Evita, or Ricky as interactable NPCs in the game, but they exist in a way to elevate the player's actions, or in other words, listen, add, and interpret. Story Story Die, weirdly enough, stay with me on this, it's very similar to Dwarf Fortress. in the sense that you're largely a passive observer to the limited effects you have on the world. These systemic systems take a limited number of effects you can have on the world. In this case, you're limited by real time versus the fast-moving in-game time, and then you watch the ripple effects of your actions across the entire system. Sometimes it's nothing, sometimes you can inadvertently create a dwarven communist revolution. By taking the player's actions in the game world, the game creates systemic responses to that stimuli and then relays that information to the player through story events in the narration box on the upper left, or by creating new behaviors in the world map that players need to seek out themselves and dissect. Why did this happen? Oh, it's because I don't know, I talked to a guy or something. To take advantage of this type of narrative play, you don't necessarily need to create a system-driven sandbox. What you can do is create conditions for the world to change based on player actions. We don't want to train players to actively do or not do something, so this should usually be mechanically neutral and should be more about tailoring the world and narrative around player choices. For example, if players have the option to pet animals, you can create narrative moments that happen as a reaction to the player doing it a lot. So instead of animals just being happy when you pet them, now they get upset if the player doesn't pet them. You can throw them in prominent scenes, or if you can manage it in a cost-effective way, you can give the player an animal companion that follows them around. Or to put it in another way, we're following the improv game loops again by prompting the player, then we listen, interpret, and add on to the player's actions, and when we identify a pattern, we build on that pattern to a logical end. In addition to audience participation games, there are absolutely tons of different warm-ups, short-form games, and long-form formats. This was the list from my first troupe, and this is a fraction of the total number of games out there. This is just like what a group of like 8 people was willing to remember. We went through a lot of sorting on that. So you can draw from these to inspire some chances for your players to actively play with your narrative and not just play, in your narrative. But while it's fun to play short-form games, it's cool to follow game loops, and it's important to remember to listen, react, respond, and justify. It's just as important to remember why improv was taught in the first place. It wasn't to create great stories. It was to make people comfortable enough to make creative decisions. And if you take away anything from this talk, it should be this quote from the Stanley Parable. Stanley, this is important. The story needs you. It needs you to make a decision. It cannot exist without you. Do you understand me? Whatever choice you make is just fine. They're both correct. You cannot be wrong here. We can work together. I'll accept whatever you do. I simply need you to take that step forward. I think I can talk about this in 3 minutes. There's like 13 minutes left here, right? Yeah, I can talk about this. Okay, this is so much fun. So first you get a suggestion from the audience. Then you have an opening scene. Usually it's going to be something very not complex. So a traditional example is a couple arguing. They're arguing about something. It really doesn't matter. It goes on for 6 or 8 minutes, but the reason that exists isn't because it's an interesting scene. No. That's where you get the thematic scenes. Because the backline has been watching everyone doing that opening scene, and they're going okay, what are some interesting things I can pull from that opening scene? And now they want to create scenes that thematically mirror that initial scene. So if the couple's arguing about vacationing, all of a sudden maybe the thematic scene is going to be about 2 people who live in that exotic locale having the exact same conversation. You can go in any weird direction. Then you go back to the opening scene, those same 2 people. Now you're basically just kind of repeating the stuff in that first opening scene, but now through the thematic scenes, the help of your partners in back, you've learned what the scene is really about, and now you can narrow that down and encompass it in only 1 or 2 minutes. Now you have the commentary scenes. Everyone's on the same page. They know what this thing is about. So you have a whole bunch of players go ahead and go through the commentary scenes where they are just actively riffing on that centralized theme. So if it's about maybe they're just one person's afraid to go out and explore new strange locales, and the other person thinks it's worth to have danger if it expands your worldview. Well, now you have a whole bunch of commentary scenes about what does exploration mean? What does sacrifice mean? How do you assess different values? That's what those commentary scenes are about, and that's where you can go really wild with it. Now we go back to the opening scene. The opening scene now has all these different things, and we need to heighten that scene extra because now we know this fight is not about going on vacation or not. It's about, are you willing to let us keep living our life the same way it always has been? And weirdly enough, that's how a lot of these scenes go. The narratives kind of get the absolute same. The important part, though, is we have all these themes that we can play with, because then we have the run, and that's just where we take all that chaos, all those random ideas, and we just come up with quick, like 2-3 minute scenes, whatever. Just go crazy up there. People go swoosh, 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 swoosh. Because in a lot of these improv formats, it's less about leading up to a final ending scene, and it's more about keeping that energy up and making it just really exciting at the end. And all of a sudden, when everyone's really enjoying it, you can cut it. That's where, and they even cover in this chart, but this is very important. How you end the scene then is you go back to that opening scene. But this time, you can go back in time, you can go forward in time, but you just, like in commedia dell'arte, you just give them a nice ending to end with. The example I often hear is, hey, let's go back to the beginning of that relationship. You know, they talk about all the places they could go to out in the world. And that's a pretty good ending. Anyway, that's my talk. There was a lot more I couldn't get to. I wanted to go over I went over the deconstruction formats. That's great. I also wanted to talk about choices that matter, because I think that's like a bullshit idea, and a really silly one that I think, like, as reviewers, go ahead, keep doing it. That's fun. But as designers, I think it's a really hurtful kind of thing to think about. But yeah, those were less, like, you know, informative than just fun musings. So yeah, now I think we can take questions. Any questions from the audience? Yo. All right, so the question was about how can you take limitless potential by just asking a player about what you want them to do, and distill that down into a reasonable number of things that you can express in the game. So I can tell you this from experience, doing a lot of improv on stage. People aren't that creative, like as like in a whole. Like, yes, you will have like really creative moments, but like if you ask somebody, like, you know, hey, name a famous person, like a lot of people will pick the same famous people. There was like a good 3-4 year period where everyone picked Kim Kardashian. For most responses, there's really just like a certain set where you can go like, okay, most people will fit those options. Yes, you might get someone who wants like a really crazy idea, but you could just not why give them that option? If there's something where it's fun to give them like a moment of creativity. I don't think necessarily expressing that in words is the best way to do it in games. With my games, actually I didn't do it in King of the Cul-de-Sac, but I do this a lot with games for kids. I usually try to give them a variety of input patterns. So, you know, yeah, you can do something like in Stardew Valley where it's like, what's your favorite food? And then you only express that food in terms of how that pops up at certain points in the narrative. I find it fun to give people like creative chances to like make a little drawing, and then all of a sudden like, oh hey, we need like a poster that's going to be for our band. Can you draw it? They draw it, and all of a sudden like when the player's not expecting it, they'll find their art around the game world. Like that's a fun, like, you know, it's sort of like a walled garden almost of like how you let them kind of explore the space. But I think those are the ones that are the least overwhelming. And I mean, obviously, if you have a large like AAA team, like none of this advice matters. Like, you know, go freaking crazy, please. I want crazy games. But for indie people, where, you know, we don't have all the time in the world, like those sort of like smaller encapsulated experiences where we can find like interesting ways to place them, that's probably the way to go. Any questions from Discord? No? All right. Any other? Yeah. So the question was, I mentioned some TTRPG systems. What are some good TTRPG systems for people who want to get good at improv? I think it's like I don't really consider them the same, really. I don't think the skills transfer as much as we'd like. It's very similar play patterns, but again, we're seeing this a lot with like the D&D stuff, where you have Critical Role, you have Dimension 20, and those are experienced actors, experienced improvisational actors, and they know they're not really playing the game, they're playing for an audience. If you try to play the same way that they do, you're not going to have that much fun. Just, have fun with your friends. If you want to get good at improv, honestly, like, improv classes are really cheap. There's usually some guides. The Comedy Improvisation Manual by UCB, like, that's a good thing to go with. When I play D&D in particular, how I like to kind of have fun and use my improv skills anyway is, I have a DM, but I will just like create backstory on the fly for my character sometimes. And, I've done this enough where I know, like, okay, is this like an appropriate, assumption I can make about this world? Like he'll mention like, oh, we need to find this one character as this unusual trait. It's just like, oh yeah, I think I met him at a wizard school a while ago, and all of a sudden the DM, who's absolutely game, he's like, yes, you do remember he cast magic of some sort. If you have people who are game, who are willing to build on in a collaborative way for that sort of stuff, like that's fun. But I would not treat them the same at all, because otherwise, like, it's rough. That was really loud. I just did that in there. All right. Did it answer your question? All right. Any other questions? Yep. Let me just clarify that. So you're asking, so improv tends to work best in comedy, rather than in other genres. Is there a genre of game that works best when you have those improv elements in them? Is that it? Okay, from a game design standpoint, if you wanted to incorporate these improv ideas, which game genre would fit best with it? I think it's less about the type of genre, and it's more about style. So I kind of played it up a little bit with the deconstruction thing. You're almost never going to get a good, satisfactory ending in an improv show. Instead, you kind of have to fake it. You start with a period of low intensity and you work it up to high intensity. And then once you hit that point of high intensity where it's like, oh my God, this is so action-packed, go ahead and end it. Oh my God, you did such a great job. Weirdly enough, I keep thinking of like bullet hell games or like any sort of like FPS, because they kind of follow that pattern where you want the game to get like crazier and crazier and crazier. And that's why a lot of the stories back then sucked, but people remember them fondly because they still kind of followed this general idea of like, we want to heighten that action, heighten the excitement, and then they left them off at a high note when everything's exploding, and you're like, oh my God, you're the best. And they go, I was the best. What a great story that was. For narrative games, I know so many people that I talk to, like they love to make sure that all the different story threads and all the things the player did lead to a nice logical end, and that's great. But I'm telling you, you don't have to do that. It's, again, nothing bad about it, but like you can also just not do that. You just kind of make it more exciting. And then you make like what the story was about more of a matter of retrospective, looking at the things that naturally emerged over time. That's where you have a lot of like, people keep Dwarf Fortress worlds where it's like, yeah, this is like the prison world. Like, I want to keep that going. I want to see where the story goes. It doesn't have to end, and we already know what it is before the ending gets there. The themes are in place. So any sort, I guess. And with that, is that time? I got 30 seconds. Does anyone have a one-word question? Okay. Blue. All right. Thank you very much. Those are my socials. Read those books. They're really great. Have a good one.